everyone! In this video, we're going to be introducing cases 14 and 15 of the regional case set, which are also our last two cases left. Let's start off with case 14, titled American Dirt. This case is about the novel American Dirt by Janine Cummins, who follows the journey of a Mexican mother and son seeking refuge in the United States. The book was widely popular, but it also faced a wave of backlash from critics who argued that the book endorsed problematic stereotypes and papered over some of the biggest challenges facing immigrants from Latin America. Additionally, Cummins herself is white and not an immigrant, which has prompted people to wonder how accurately she can depict struggles that she's never faced, and why she should get so much acclaim when people of more relevant demographics aren't. Of course, Cummins herself has explained that she wrote the book with the intention to remain apolitical, and that she only wanted to upend stereotypes and help her readers accept that these people are still people. In addition, some Mexican-American authors have even endorsed the book, claiming that Cummins' book had the potential to change minds and positively influence people who might not be as inclined to read a story written by a Mexican-American author. The following case questions ask us about the purpose of writing fiction and the responsibilities we have while doing so. With that being said, let's get into the case questions.
The first question opens the discussion by saying, to what extent do we have a duty to refrain from telling certain stories, even if these stories are fictional? Relating this question back to recent matters, I think a lot of us have heard about cultural appropriation from different places, including TikTok. Sometimes, by being someone else and never experiencing such hardships, make you unqualified to tell a story or do a certain thing, even if they're fictional. However, a question I have for you is, if by telling these stories that are not considered yours, you are helping the people that have actually experienced it, in this case, can you tell the story? Another additional question is, what are the other factors, except for race that we're focusing on for this case specifically, which refrain you from telling a story? Could it be another type of experience, such as traumatic event? Alright, that's it for question 1, and now we're moving on to the second question.
Next, the second case question asks, to what extent does who we are impact the sorts of stories we can and should tell? This question asks us about the relationship between our identities and the types of stories we can tell. This is related to the idea of identity politics, which is essentially the tendency for people who identify a certain way to support certain beliefs or political ideas. What is crucial about the identity of identity politics is the experiences of the person, especially their experience within social structures that differentiate with their identity. Simply put, telling stories and promoting certain beliefs hinges on the idea that the person can identify with certain experiences. Based on this idea, our identities do impact the sorts of stories we can tell, since it's difficult, if not impossible, for us to tell stories about experiences that we've never had. However, now that we know what types of stories we can tell, let's talk about what types of stories we should tell. Even though authors may not have experienced the events of stories they tell, they can do research, learn about the stories, and then write about them. I think we should approach this question first by dissecting it under consequentialism and deontology. The consequences of telling stories are pretty unpredictable, so consequentialism probably isn't the best framework for this discussion. However, the intent of telling stories is usually pretty easy to find, whether that be to inspire others, to teach others about an important concept, etc. That being said, deontology is the best framework we can use in this discussion. So, what is the purpose of telling stories? Well, there's a New York Times article written about this idea, and the author of that article explains that stories are written with one of two purposes: empathy or exploitation. We've linked this article in the email we sent out, but in short, empathy is about deepening connections with others, while exploitation is about filling one's pockets with money. So really, the types of stories that we should tell pretty much comes down to our intent in telling them. If we intend to spread awareness and increase empathy about a certain topic, then we should tell those stories. But if our stories are told with the purpose of making money or generating fame, then we should not tell those stories. Next, the third question is, Parl Segal criticizes the book for being determinedly apolitical. What is the purpose of fiction? What is the proper place of fictional stories ethically or politically? By definition, fiction is not necessarily political. Things like science fiction or fantasy are usually meant to be apolitical. But people can not only tell and engage with fictional stories, they can also reflect on the content of stories and on the way that they are told. So given this idea, it's clear that fictional stories do indeed have the potential to make ethical and political impacts. However, the proper place of those stories really just depends on what the author intended to do with them. The fourth question asks us, do the intentions of the artist make a difference to the quality of the art that artist creates? As well as, does the moral character of the artist make a difference to the quality of the art they create? The first question is kind of similar to what we talked about in question 3. The intentions of the artist do indeed make a difference to the quality of the art they create, because that artist has the power to choose the subject of their art, how they portray it, and how they choose to explain it to the audience. The second question, however, is a bit more complicated. There isn't really a way for us to use philosophy to answer this question, but we can pull from real-world examples of artists who aren't necessarily morally upright. There are plenty of examples of filmmakers, comedians, and writers who have said or done ethically dubious things, but their works are still well-known and even critically acclaimed. So clearly, the moral character of the audience doesn't necessarily have an impact on the quality of the art they create. Although the artists themselves may face backlash and boycotts against their work, these acts of cancellation are not really an indictment of their work, but rather the artists themselves. So the answer to the second question would be no. The moral character of the artist does not necessarily make a difference to the quality of the art they can create. Finally, the fifth case question is, Cummins maintains that she did the work and only wanted to upend the stereotypes that she saw. Did Cummins herself do anything morally blameworthy in writing the novel? This question relates to what we discussed in the second case question. In the second question, we determined that deontology seems to be a better fit with this case, so we'll continue using it for question 5. Cummins' intention when writing American Dirt was good. She wanted to fight stereotypes and increase her audience's understanding of Mexican immigrants. Of course, she, as a white person, doesn't personally relate to the story, but the case mentions that she has done 5 years of research on the subject. While the backlash she faces for telling a story that she doesn't identify with is understandable, her intent was good, so she isn't at moral fault under the idea of deontology. However, if you guys choose to look at this question through a consequentialist perspective, you might have come up with different responses, and we'll go over everyone's ideas at our next meeting. Alright, so now that we've finished discussing case 14, let's move on to our last case from the regional case set, titled The Tiger King. This case revolves around a popular Netflix documentary series titled Tiger King, which describes a community of big cat collectors. The documentary series focuses on a man named Joe Exotic, who has one of the country's largest collections of wild cats, and his competitor, a woman named Carol Baskin, who is the founder of Big Cat Rescue and an animal rights activist. Although the series was successful, it portrayed Joe Exotic as a sympathetic character while villainizing Carol Baskin. It also exposed the viewers to animal abuse, worker abuse, and even Joe Exotic's attempts to arrange for Mrs. Baskin's assassination. Additionally, critics have noted that there is an undertone of misogyny at work within the series. After the documentary's release, memes and petitions about the characters were on the rise, so it's clear that there are real-life consequences of even a documentary series. Even though documentaries can have lasting effects for anyone involved in the production, extreme depictions of reality are undeniably popular. These conflicts are exacerbated by the fact that there are no real rules or codes of conduct for ethical standards in documentary production. The following case questions ask us about how documentaries should portray ethically dubious characters, and how much they are obligated to stick to the truth. So with that, let's get into the case questions. The first case question asks us, how should documentaries portray ethically dubious characters? Before we actually discuss this, I just want to remind you guys that this case is about documentaries, not movies. So when we discuss these case questions, we have to consider the fact that the characters in the documentary are real people who have to face the public's opinion about the events of the documentary. The purpose of a documentary is to portray a nuanced perspective of the characters and the events it follows. The case itself also mentions that though there isn't a specific documentary code of conduct for ethical standards, most filmmakers usually adopt universal standards like doing no harm, protecting the vulnerable, and honoring the viewer's trust. Given that the purpose of a documentary is to educate the viewers about something that is happening in the world, it's clear that documentaries are supposed to tell the truth. Whether the characters are good, bad, or ethically gray, documentaries, by definition, are supposed to portray them as truthfully as possible. Additionally, philosopher Immanuel Kant, who also happens to be the same guy that made a ton of contributions to the idea of deontology, explains that everyone has the duty to tell the truth, because straying from the truth, aka lying, is almost always done with a bad intent. So with that in mind, the answer to this case question would probably be something along the lines of, documentaries should portray ethically dubious characters as close to the truth as possible. Otherwise, the documentary may create a distorted truth.
Okay, we just talked about the importance of telling the truth in documentaries. Therefore, the second question asks us if slightly bending the truth to make the story more compelling is permissible. Here are the original words of the question. To what extent is moral and ethical editorializing an inevitable part of storytelling through documentaries? Notice how the question uses words moral and ethical editorialization, or the editing of a person's persona to possibly fit them into the character that they are in the story. We all know that iconic stories that are passed down from generation to generation often contain a protagonist and an antagonist. Much similar to the Wildcat documentary we're talking about here, one is made to be positive while the other is villainized. There is a certain power in doing this, which makes the characters more distinguishable and makes the story easy to remember. By doing this, the storytellers also could easily highlight what they think the correct to do are, because the protagonist does all of these correct things in the story. From the iconic stories we grew up hearing, each character is ethically and morally edited so that their persona is distinguishable. However, again remember, we're dealing with documentaries here, not such heroic stories with a strong message. As Grace said in the previous question, documentaries should focus on presenting the whole truth as accurately as possible, because that is what the audiences watch documentaries for. Accurate and educational information. Although I do recognize morally editing things makes it easier to convey the message, however, lying from a deontology perspective is still morally wrong. So the question here is, do the beneficial effects of moral editing outweigh the fact that it's lying? For example, can I portray a company as good through a documentary because they are doing good things to the environment? But can I ignore certain wrongdoings they're also making to make my story reach more people and more effective? To what extent can I do that for? My personal answer would probably lean towards a more utilitarian approach. Documentaries should stay as accurate to the truth as possible, but if omitting certain information has a greater impact on the message, and say the message is a beneficial one, then yes, it is inevitable and maybe should be permissible. Alright, now the third question is something that we just touched on earlier. It says, to what extent should accuracy and fidelity to the truth take precedence over effective storytelling? You might have noticed that this specific case has harder worded questions, and that is totally okay because cases are written by different high school students. To simplify this question, in case you have missed it, it asks, to what extent should accuracy and honesty be weighted heavier than effective storytelling? For this question, we're just going to go swiftly over because a lot of it has been discussed in the previous question. I think one thing here that we should focus on is, what does effective storytelling mean? Is it simply to convey a powerful story and make impressions on an audience? Is it to drive views on documentaries and make the stories a hot topic? Or can a beneficial message be hidden behind the storytelling? I think if a documentary outweighs accuracy and honesty to reach effectiveness of strong storytelling only to make people watch it more and make it become a moneymaker, it is straying away from the purpose of documentaries and, in my opinion, is morally wrong. However, if the effective storytelling drives an action, advocates for something beneficial, then perhaps the effective storytelling aspect can be valued more over accuracy. Alright, now the last question is more interesting, I think. It asks, how can filmmakers ensure that problematic assumptions and norms do not infect their stories? Living in a world that is heavily influenced by societal norms, it is sometimes hard to stand above the situation and take unbiased actions, including making a documentary that is not infected with assumptions or norms. I am just going to leave a few ideas here, and please take a few minutes to come up with your own thoughts after watching the video. First off, filmmakers can choose to not omit footages just because they don't fit a certain image to get closer to the truth. They could get closer to displaying the truth by selecting multiple aspects of the thing they're filming on, including the good, neutral, and bad sides. Because that is what the nature of everything is, sometimes flawed but sometimes good. In addition, they themselves should do deep research before filming on a subject to make sure that their end result, which is being presented to the audience, is truly what they have seen while filming the subject and what they have felt. All of it is impossible if the filmmaker's goal is to make money and not portraying the truth, however. Alright, hopefully that induced some thoughts for those of you watching the video. Have a great rest of your day, and we will see you soon.